Hey, everybody. I'm Tim Grieve, the executive editor of Protocol, and I want to welcome you to today's discussion about the challenges involved in distributing the COVID vaccines. I also want to thank our sponsor, Salesforce, for making this event possible. When we launched Protocol earlier this year, it's safe to say that I had no expectation that our new tech publication would be talking about vaccines. But that was February, and the world has obviously changed since then. And if our mission at Protocol is to cover the people, power, and politics of tech, well, it's hard to imagine a subject that invokes all three of those things more than the challenge of getting vaccines quickly and equitably to millions and billions of people around the world. In a few minutes, Protocol senior reporter Issy Lepowski will lead a discussion with some of the leaders on the front lines of this work. To set the stage for that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Ashwini Sunuz, the GM of the Global Healthcare and Life Sciences vertical at Salesforce and the company's Chief Medical Officer. Dr. Ash, welcome.
Thank you, Tim. Glad to be here.
Glad to have you. As the role of a chief medical officer is a fairly new one for tech companies, at least. And I know that you yourself have taken it on fairly recently and as sort of a side job to your real job, right? Can you tell us a little about what you do and given the spread of COVID, how it's different than what you thought you would be doing as a CMO?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a physician by background. And so when I joined Salesforce 2+ years ago, my primary role was to bring my clinical and my health administration knowledge so that we could help guide strategy to our technology and innovation. Of course, I would say that this year has been a shock to all of us in what's transpired. So while it's incredibly unfortunate that we are in this pandemic, I would say that it's been an honor to be here during this time and to expand my role. I've been able to partner with other leaders within the company and collaborate with governments and other organizations, nonprofits, companies, et cetera, to bring my clinical and public health knowledge and skill set, particularly back to this company, so that we can make scalable impact, not only in the technology to help fight this pandemic, but how we support our own employees during this time. So I'm incredibly grateful to be in this role.
And it's a very opportune moment, obviously, for today's discussion. We are literally a day into vaccines at this point in the US, at least. Seeing the news photos from around the country yesterday, it was easy to really revel in this amazing moment when people are actually getting the vaccine. At the same time, I was struck by those photos. It was a person here, a person there, and it really underscored for me how far we have to go before we're at the scale of vaccines that we need to have. As the process begins, what do you think are the biggest challenges involved in getting us from here to there?
Yeah, I think, look, this is definitely, let's take a moment to pause and celebrate where we are today, right? From where we were earlier in the year. This is now light at the end of the tunnel, and seeing those photos and seeing those healthcare workers get their vaccinations, it's incredibly emotional to me when I think about all of my colleagues that are out there on the front lines. But let's just confirm that this is a historic mobilization effort that we have not seen in public health to date. We are talking about delivering billions of doses around the world. Just in the United States, we have 21 million healthcare workers. And while a lot of this planning has been underway to sort out the complex logistics, the partnerships, the ultra cold storage, this is going to be a tough effort. So I would say, let me start by saying, this would not be possible without the public-private collaboration to solve not only the treatment, but now the vaccines at this scale. So we need the continued transparency and collaboration and not working in silos. This is also not a one and done. This is going to go on for a few years. So we need to be able to collaborate. Second of all, I would say there is definitely some vaccine hesitancy, even among healthcare workers, as I talk to my colleagues on the front lines. While they are clinicians and or scientists or both, we need to ensure that there's clear, transparent, and truthful communication so that we have the appropriate uptake, not only within the front lines, but beyond that into our communities globally. I think it's our responsibility to provide these facts, including the science of this. There are some unique things about this particular vaccine compared to the others that we've had in the past. We need to explain, how did we get these scientific answers so quickly? How are there so many more people involved in these trials, and how did we get them out so fast? And what are the things that we don't yet understand about this? And I think it's, to me, it's very justified skepticism on these clinical trials and the new vaccines. And we need to be able to clearly, have clear communication channels for these. And I think it's an obstacle to not only distributing, but getting people to take this if we don't do that. I think I heard you say when you did this introduction, about some of the things that have transpired, particularly in the United States when it comes to people of color. They remember the horrific, past of the Tuskegee syphilis trials or the experimentation on enslaved women. And so these are fresh in their minds. So when we're talking about giving vaccines out, especially to these communities of color, I think we have to communicate these sort of like clear communication, pervasive communication that's positive head on to explain why not only is it important, but from a health equity perspective, why it's really important to get these vaccines out into these communities that are hardest hit by this pandemic. So I would say, public-private partnerships, collaboration. Third, I would say, to your point earlier, we can't end this pandemic if we don't have a global strategy. And so we need equitable distribution. So excited to be here today to listen to the conversation that's coming on this later on. I would say, given that we are a global economy, we need to have a global strategy. But, I think we've all heard some of the comments that have been out in the news around the UN Secretary General, for example, being concerned around vaccine nationalism. We need to be aware that many people in low-income countries might have to wait until 2023 or 2024 for the vaccines. Or we've heard about poorer countries where only 1 in 10 people may get vaccination during this year or next. I think these are all things that we have to take into account. We can't have a siloed strategy. So I'm excited, to hear more about what we're doing with Gavi and what their efforts are and the panel discussion that's coming up. The last thing I would say, I am in a technology company, so I would say that technology is a key component to help, navigate this complexity with great agility. So those are the 4 things I would say that we need to get done to get these out there, to get the vaccines out there.
Great. Can you, and I know we should move on quickly here, but can you share just briefly a little bit about the Gavi partnership that was announced today?
Yeah, absolutely. We're really excited. We announced that we will be collaborating to help, collaborating with Gavi to manage critical information so that they can equitably distribute their 2 billion vaccines to 190 countries by the end of 2021. We are partnering on the technology platform so that we can provide transparency on the availability and collaboration between the different countries.
Great. Well, Dr. Ash, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks again to Salesforce for sponsoring this event. Now we're going to have a very brief video from Salesforce as we bring on Issy Lepowski and the panel.
Building on salesforcework.com, which is already deployed by cities, states, and companies around the world to help make their workplaces and communities safe, Work.com for Vaccines will help governments and healthcare organizations more safely and efficiently manage vaccine programs at scale. With Work.com for Vaccines, customers will be able to design, build, integrate, and manage their vaccine programs end-to-end with a platform that is trusted, flexible, and can be deployed quickly. As vaccines become available, people can easily find helpful information and schedule their vaccinations, which provides governments and healthcare organizations with the information needed for forecasting and administration. When they arrive for their appointment, clinical staff can access the person's record, which provides a full 360-degree view of their COVID-19 immunization history and health information. Clinical staff can then leverage information with the latest public health guidance, making it easier to follow best practices and offer great care. And they can update the person's record to reflect any administration information and dosage specifics. Key metrics from these processes provide health officials with insights into the progress of their vaccination programs. Those insights can then be quickly turned into action around things like reported health concerns, supply availability, and vaccination preparedness. Learn more about how to design, build, integrate, and manage your vaccine programs end-to-end with a platform that is trusted, flexible, and can be deployed quickly. With Work.com for Vaccines from Salesforce.
Hi, everyone. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? All right. Thank you so much for joining us today. We've got a really exciting group with us. I've already learned a lot from them, talking to them in pre-interviews. They are a cross-section of public health experts, tech experts, people from the philanthropic sector, and they're going to walk us through the technical and logistical sides of rolling out this vaccine, tracking it, storing it, and making sure it is being distributed equitably. Our panel today includes Dr. Samira Asma from the World Health Organization. She is the Assistant Director General for Data Analytics and Delivery. We have Dr. Esti Garrity, Chief Medical Officer at the mapping software company Esri. We have Dr. Saad Omer, Director of the Yale Institute for Global Health and a member of the National Academy's Committee on Equitable Distribution of the COVID-19 Vaccine. And we have Andrew Schroeder, Vice President of Research and Analysis for the humanitarian aid organization Direct Relief. I want to thank them all for joining us. And if you in the audience have any questions today, you can drop them into the little Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and I will pass them along. All right. Dr. Asma, I wanted to start with you. Obviously, these are really exciting, scary, but exciting times as we see the vaccine being rolled out in the US. You lead data and analytics efforts at WHO. And so now that the vaccine is being rolled out, tell me a little bit about what data points you are tracking and how that data is translating into policy and planning for countries that don't have the vaccine yet.
First of all, thank you for hosting this panel. And it is an incredibly timely moment as the first countries are preparing to roll out the vaccines. I would like to begin by saying well-functioning data systems is extremely important for continuously monitoring vaccinations throughout the COVID vaccination program. So that we can all collectively make the measurable impact in the lives of people that we are serving. It's important also to establish standard procedures for monitoring various critical program planning and implementation elements, including performance targets, resourcing, staffing, and various activities. I think it is going to be very crucial in terms of vaccine distribution, modeling, analysis, and providing that flexible and real-time process so that we can make data-driven decisions. What we are doing is building on the ACT Accelerator, the COVAX, that was co-initiated with WHO, Gavi, and CEPI. I think it has been a tremendous success where over 189 countries covering about 90% of the world's population have signed on, and this has never been such a solidarity experience with the intent that there is an equitable distribution and access to all people everywhere. So keeping that in mind, and as the vaccines are rolled out, it is important to ensure that we have a system that is well-functioning in each country. And we know that there are data challenges, and it is a formidable challenge to build on the existing infrastructure, and it is variable across the countries. And what we have done at WHO has set up monitoring and vaccination introduction status and indicators and targets in terms of which phases the countries need to roll out the vaccines. And we are working very closely with our regional offices and member states to ensure the tracking, systematic tracking as the vaccines are rolled out.
And when the countries join on to COVAX, what are they agreeing to share? What kind of information are they sharing among themselves?
Currently, we are building a set of monitoring framework as to what the data that needs to be shared, and building on the existing vaccination programs in terms of having the routine information on age, sex, making sure that the data is disaggregated not only at national but also at subnational level. And we are now developing the indicators and a monitoring and evaluation framework in terms of the whole data ecosystem and architecture. And there is already within the COVAX accelerator, we also have an agreement and understanding in terms of sharing of tools and technologies. And it is very important with the dialogue and the conversation that we are going to have in terms of the entire supply chain to ensure that we are being responsive to the member states as the vaccines are rolled out.
And what are you finding are some of the biggest gaps in data, especially in the developing countries that might not have been tracking this to the same extent as the US or other countries? What are some of the gaps that are hardest pieces of data to get your hands on as an international organization?
Sure. I think we are also drawing and taking the examples and experiences from the recent polio, for example, vaccination campaign, and what were the steps that made the vaccination campaign and the vaccination process successful, where the African region recently was declared polio-free, and also drawing on from the routine surveillance, vaccination and surveillance programs. There are definitely data gaps at various stages in terms of the routine health information systems. We have gaps there, and we are working with the countries to strengthen those systems so that the health facilities and the routine health information systems, the supply chain, access to facilities, the health workforce, all of that ecosystems are being reviewed at the moment, ensuring that all countries have the infrastructure that is necessary. There are data gaps,
right,
especially in a number of countries, but the commitment of having a very equitable partnership through the COVAX facility, I think we should be able to make this work in all countries.
And we heard in the opening remarks that, in some developing countries, people may be waiting until 2023, 2024 to receive the vaccine. What is going to be happening during that time? What is the holdup? Is it setting up the supply chain? Is it actually getting the stock of vaccine? And B, what are going to be the stopgap solutions over the course of those years for those countries?
I think it will be in a number of phases. WHO is coming up with interim guidelines in terms of the different phases, as we are seeing now in the United States and in other countries, how the vaccine supply initially and midterm and long term, and how the countries are going to prioritize the population to whom the vaccination should be first prioritized. Those systems and those guidance are being prepared in consultation with experts and member states, so that those should be rolled out. The gaps that we will see as the vaccines are going to be rolled out and the information systems are going to be crucial to see where the gaps are and where the deployment should occur, and how we can overcome the roadblocks that the countries would face. And without data and real-time reliable, actionable data, it will not be easy for us. So investing simultaneously in strengthening countries' data and health information systems capacity is going also to be very crucial. And we have seen with COVID that there are significant data gaps in a number of countries, and even reporting the cases and the deaths. So there are two parts going hand in hand, strengthening the data systems as well as ensuring the rollout is equitable and simultaneously strengthening the country's capacity.
Andrew, I want to bring
I
you
want to
in
make
here.
one more comment. It
Oh,
is
sure,
very important
Go ahead.
that the data belongs to the country, and we want to make sure that the process is respectful of the country's sovereignty as well. So sorry about that.
That's a really important point. No, I'm glad you made that point. Andrew, because direct relief is really waist deep in the supply chain side of things, I wanted to bring you in. You've got your own cold chain distribution in California. You're working on building out the cold chain in countries around the world. For people who aren't familiar, can you just walk us through the lifespan of the vaccine supply chain? What technology is required along the way to get the vaccine from the lab to hopefully my arm someday?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the first thing to remember is that it is a chain. So it's a linked set of technologies that are distributed in uneven ways around the world. So, and it depends on which vaccine you're talking about. So, for instance, the most stringent of all of the vaccines right now is the Pfizer vaccine, which requires cold chain temperatures at -94 Fahrenheit, which is an extreme Antarctic level that requires its own packaging system. So, it has to be put into that packaging system that utilizes dry ice and allows for it to get out to areas that are going to use it. That requires a monitoring system that monitors the temperature and other conditions as it's moved around. It has to get into transportation. The transportation requires monitoring onto trucks or airplanes or whatever wherever it's going. It gets into end user facilities that have to have refrigeration systems that are able to either manage that by transferring it into refrigeration, or, and I think this is important to remember, that places that are not going to have refrigeration systems that actually transfer that, where they're going to manage it by trying to match supply and demand, and then distribute in a relatively rapid period directly out of the packaging that is sent with it. And that gets less stringent for different vaccines. So Moderna is a less stringent requirement, although still frozen. And the hope is for other vaccines like AstraZeneca or the Johnson & Johnson vaccine that will come out later to have even lower level requirements that go into things that are not much different than the way you would distribute cold beverages around the world that go into 2 to 8 centigrade. And there is actually a fairly widely distributed system for doing that. It's important that data logging of all of that is actually a crucial technology. I mean, it's not new, but the ability to real-time monitor those conditions and the conditions of goods as they move around the world is going to be one of the key data gaps that we're trying to fill. And then, obviously there have to be health workers at the other end that are trained in how to be able to administer vaccines at the scale that we're talking about. 20 million health workers in the United States, but vastly more than that in other parts of the world. It's not actually entirely clear that we have enough health workers that are trained to actually administer these vaccines, and how we actually improve those training conditions for the global health workforce is going to be, I think, a pretty significant piece of the puzzle as we go forward.
Right. And all those tech tools that you just described, the tracking, monitoring, storage, that's technology that already exists, right? It's just a problem of scale at this point. Or is that technology that's being developed as we speak?
I think most of this all of the technology that I just mentioned already exist. I think the deployment of them at scale is the question. I was on a panel the other day where they were talking about the refrigeration problem, and one of the lines that stuck with me was that we think about this as one of the world's greatest challenges for the distribution of a health commodity, but this is also the single largest refrigeration problem that we've ever faced as a society. As a global society. So refrigeration is not new. Even ultra cold refrigeration is not new, but deployment of that capacity at the scale required by the COVID vaccination program is new. And it's not clear that we have that capacity right now. In fact, actually, if we were talking right now about needing to scale the conditions for the Pfizer vaccine globally, there's no chance that we actually are even remotely in the ballpark. We do not, nor would we be able to meet that. It's also worth remembering that the chain doesn't stop at the point where it goes in your arm. We also have to dispose of all these technologies once we actually get them out. So, all of the medical waste that is then produced by the largest vaccination program that we've ever seen, it has to go somewhere. It can't, sometimes it gets burned. Sometimes people actually end up with injuries as a result of it, but it's dramatically more of it in this case than we've ever seen before. So
Wow.
Thinking all the way through the life cycle, including to the refrigerants that are used that are themselves greenhouse gases as we distribute them out. And, as we scale up refrigeration programs, we don't really want to be scaling up climate change risks at the same time. So I think that systems approach is going to be one of the key issues at the global level.
Right. And when you and I were talking, in addition to Dr. Asma talking about data gaps, you were saying that, especially in developing countries, we don't know where the cold chain is. Like there's
Totally.
no central repository that tells you where all the dry ice and refrigeration is in the world. So who's working on cracking that problem? And is that a problem that is solvable in the time that we need it to be solved?
Yeah, I think this is actually one of the central questions. I mean, this is like, there's an old saying that, war is how Americans learn geography. I think, pandemics are clearly one of the things that have taught us that we need to know a lot more about things like cold chain. And even though we've had a need for this information for a long time, I don't think that it was ever accelerated to the point of needing to know everywhere at once, all at the same time. So we don't, for instance, know where all the vaccine refrigerators are in the world. We don't actually have a track on, the transport networks that connect them, the strong and weak points. There's a need for creating both a framework for that knowledge, and I'm sure Esty can speak to this really directly from Esri's point of view, and then link together, where is that capacity? How large is that capacity? How reliable is that capacity? So in some places, refrigerators exist, but they're not terribly well maintained and they're not reliable. That's quite important if you're talking about potentially losing enormous stocks of vaccine. We need to be able to think about that in terms of strategic capacity investments, right? So Direct Relief has invested heavily in expanding refrigeration capacity in Puerto Rico because we saw that after Hurricane Maria, 90% of the vaccines on the island were wiped out because of the power outages. So we not only then had to put vaccine refrigerators in, we also had to think in terms of resilient power supplies and putting solar energy in that's connected to back up those loads so that we don't see that one event could wipe out the entire supply all at once. As we've done this in other islands, we've begun investigating in California, where you'd think that there would be a better situation than there is right now. But even in California, in terms of redundant and resilient refrigeration supply at the primary care level, this is very uneven and requires a very thoughtful, targeted, spatially aware approach as we kind of build out this capacity that will be required to go forward.
Right. So you mentioned spatial awareness. So I have to bring in Dr. Garrity, who is our representative from Esri, which is a mapping software company. So as Andrew was mentioning, trying to map out where the cold chain is and all these data gaps that we need to fill. Tell me a little bit about how Esri is going after finding that data and integrating it into the products that you guys sell, or that local governments and state governments use, that you guys produce.
Sure. I think there's maybe three ways that we're approaching this. The first way is that we partner with lots and lots of organizations, and we look to those organizations if they have relevant data and ask if they might share it during the pandemic. And several organizations have stepped up and provided really relevant data. One that I would highlight here is Definitive Healthcare. They provided a data set that was much needed early in the pandemic when people were asking, where are all of the licensed hospitals in the US, where you would think that information would be really easy to find. How many beds does each hospital have? How many ICU beds? How many ventilators? And Definitive Healthcare stepped up and they shared their data for free so that we could make that available to the country. So that's one way that we do it. Another way is you can collect the data, simply making surveys available where it's really easy for people to, for example, in the cold storage question, answer, do you have X, Y, or Z level of refrigeration or freezing capacity within your institution. And so you can make those surveys available and collect the data. Obviously the slowest way, but certainly possible. I think the biggest challenge there is getting the message to everybody and getting them to respond. The third way that we've been thinking about it, that Andrew, you reminded me of as you were talking about, in other places and in the US where we just don't have an idea of the refrigeration capacity across the board, we've been trying to brainstorm on proxy measures. So for example, if you're looking at ultra cold storage, what else in the medical sphere has to be stored in ultra cold storage? And can we look at billing information where an institution has billed for that thing, implying that they have the capacity to store it? So we've been trying to look for these proxy markers for different aspects to see if at least we can get a starting data set and then go through and validate as things come up to improve the data. So that's how we've been approaching those questions.
Got it. And so for our audience, the idea would be that as you guys collect that data, you're able to map it out in Esri software, and then any local governments you work with as they're planning their distribution plans can say, well, here's where our cold storage is, here's where our hospitals are, here's where we have the most at-risk population, things like that. But these are all examples. So do you have any specific examples of how governments have used your technology and what their greatest needs are right now?
Yes, it's been interesting. We outlined 5 steps for this spatial approach to vaccination distribution, really targeted at that state and local government level. So the states in the US being responsible for, some states are very large, so micro-planning sounds like the wrong word in a way, but it is that still more local level of planning for distribution. So targeting in that way, the steps that we outlined were first to be able to identify those facilities. So we sort of had that conversation, which vaccination venues will be a part of distributing vaccine in your plan. And we suggest not only outlining the venues that are currently able to deliver vaccine and maybe always have of different types, your measles shots and your annual flu shots, but also identifying other candidate vaccine venues, maybe those that aren't always delivering vaccine, but are used to the healthcare realm. This might be blood banks, it could be dialysis centers, it could be poison control personnel. A lot of these places are staffed by MDs and nurses who could participate when there's this surge of plenty sounds like the wrong word, but more vaccine and a demand for it. So identifying the facilities. The second part would be prioritizing the populations. Dr. Asma talked about that. And the idea here is that if we're going to get to the end of the pandemic as quickly as possible, we need to be smart about the way that we distribute the vaccine. So obviously, vaccinating our healthcare professionals comes first. We see that happening already because we have to protect the healthcare infrastructure, who will take care of us if everybody is sick. So it's that kind of mentality leading to the different vaccination groups. So we prioritize and map those. Then the third step is a matching game. You've got your facilities, your populations. How do those match within an acceptable access parameter? That could be For some people, it needs to be a walk time when you're thinking about vulnerabilities and access to care. For some people, it'll be a reasonable drive time. Whatever those access parameters are, using a geographic perspective, you can determine whether there's a match and at the same time determine where there's not a match. So where you have gaps and you need to do something extra to serve the rest of the population. That's where you might have mobile outreach or stand-up drive-through vaccination clinics that may be temporary. The fourth step that we advocate and can support is managing the vaccine inventory. You've already heard a little bit about that. The vaccine doesn't last a really long time. It can degrade if the conditions aren't kept. So you need to constantly be watching the movement of that vaccine, even once it's at its destination. When you take it out of cold storage, you start a new clock. When you open the vaccine vial, you start a new clock, and you have new expiration dates at each phase. So you have to be cognizant of those so that you don't waste vaccine. And then the last part is, I think has also been mentioned even in the preview talk that we had before we started this panel, and that is the communication piece. It's so important to provide transparency in what's going on in the process, letting people know when is it their turn to be vaccinated and where can they go. All of the things that I think about start with the word where. Where can they go to get their vaccine? And what is the wait time when they go so that they can plan their day and it's as seamless as possible, which really encourages others to think that this is a worthwhile process. So we have lots of different ways that we can support the end-to-end workflow with geography.
Well, you gave me the perfect segue to Dr. Ulmer, because you were part of the National Academy's committee that drafted up the framework for equitable distribution of the vaccine. And part of that was dealing with vaccine hesitancy and dealing with the communication aspect of convincing people to get vaccinated. So do you believe now that the US has an effective plan in place in terms of communicating with communities that need to get vaccinated?
I think we have made progress as a country. I see CDC's Vaccinate with Confidence program, which has now been repurposed. A version of it has been repurposed for COVID-19 as a very useful and helpful step. But I don't think we are there in terms of matching the moment. This is the most nuanced, most complex, most complicated, largest in the shortest amount of time vaccination program that the US is undertaking, the world is undertaking. And we knew this was coming. We knew that was the end game. As I often say, that all these biological disaster movies start with the scientist with a vaguely ethnic accent warning about impending doom, and ends with a vaccine being deployed. And so this movie has played out, similarly. There's a lot happened in the middle. And so we knew this was coming. And I wish as a country, there had been more preparedness around it. And communication is not just about persuading people, it is about informing people as well. And in fact, there is a nuanced perspective that a lot of us take of this, of vaccine acceptance and demand, that it is and a lot of it starts, and a lot of the focus should be at the interface of the supply side of vaccines and demand side, because there's no sort of clear demarcation. And a lot of vaccine behavior is driven by access, by convenience. And there are behavioral insights into it, and it's a balance of convenience that often dictates whether someone who's on the fence about it ends up getting it or not. So that's one thing. The other thing is that we have to make sure that we engage communities, build trust, but engage communities at scale. So this is no time for another pilot. One of the best things and one of the most frequent things, folks like myself, academic public health professionals do pilots. And we suffer from what some of us call pilotitis. It's almost a disease. But this is time to go to scale and have impact at scale. And one way of doing that, as some of us have been proposing, is there's different approaches to doing that. of working with communities while doing it at scale. There are templates to do so. For example, one model is community grounded experts like physicians who are working there already. In the US, in the US context, it's those who are in federally qualified health centers, for example, or others who have connections with the communities, various communities, and pair them up with community validators. For example, a church leader, a tribal leader, a community leader. The validator's job is not to be an expert overnight. God knows that real experts have to stay up to date on a sort of 24/7 basis to remain on top of this kind of stuff. But the idea is to have this a mass education program for healthcare providers, and CDC already has mechanisms for that. But there can be approaches that can be added to for community engagement and that kind of stuff. Pair them up with community validators who turn the gaze of the community to the expert and then repeat that template again and again and again. So that's one way of doing it. And then there are other sort of mass level stuff. We did some survey experiments that showed that if you had, this was done well before the election, that if you had endorsement, if you had vaccine approval in December versus a week before the election, the acceptance will be much higher if the approval is around December. And this is what's happening. And I think this is going to, and there are signs that it is moving people. The other thing is we experimented which elite endorsers would be helpful. And turns out Dr. Fauci was off the charts. And not just for one political inclination, although there were differences between political backgrounds and the value of his endorsement, it was across the board moving people to different extent. So that kind of stuff will move us there. But also, we need to have evidence-based communications beyond that. I've been saying that this is a marathon at sprint speeds. And so therefore, at the end of the day, we have to step back and say that we demand the same level of evidence, the same level of rigor from vaccine acceptance and communication science as we do from vaccine development science. Because often when we get to it, people go with their hunches, what feels right, what looks good on TV, and so on and so forth. There's a whole set of evidence out there. So we shouldn't stop short of using that level of sort of rigor in vaccine acceptance science as we do for vaccine development science.
Right. And I got a question in the Q&A box, which actually was a question I was going to ask because I'm a tech reporter. Obviously, people get these hunches and wrong ideas about vaccines oftentimes from social media. So what is the role of tech companies in fighting that misinformation or emphasizing authoritative information, and how good of a job do you think they're doing so far?
So first of all, to take a nuanced approach. Sometimes actually an empty chair on a talk show is the answer. So first, there are criteria, and there's sort of WHO guidance that is coming out on part of the Global Advisory Committee for Vaccine Safety, as well as the WHO Working Group for COVID-19 vaccines that is a working group of strategic advisory group of experts for vaccination. So there's a lot of discussion happening both globally and, as you said, in the NASEM report, we had some of these approaches mentioned as well. The bottom line is that you have a way, so there is misinformation and then there's other set of acceptance. In terms of misinformation itself, there are decision rules that say that you don't answer every little thing. So depending on who's saying it, and again, the role of data saying there are now metrics that you can use to say whether it is likely to go beyond a small group of people. So you shouldn't be increasing the salience of something by putting it out there. So that's another thing. But if you do meet those criteria, the way to respond to that often is not directly respond to the myth, is to bypass these circuits and emphasize some of the other stuff. So, trust-related factors, give the positive message, etc. And so a tech company, for example, doesn't always have to directly confront it, because the reason I'm saying is that there is a potential, there is evidence. It doesn't happen always. Fact-checking, there's new evidence says sometimes works, but there is a set of messages that can backfire. So if I ask you to absolutely not think of, warm and fuzzy bunnies, and work really hard not to think of warm and fuzzy bunnies in a winter afternoon, you will inevitably be thinking of those. So you can increase the salience of the myth by repeating it, even if you are addressing it through other things. The third thing is that sometimes you have to address the myth directly. There are evidence-based approaches. First of all, label the myth. What used to happen, the fair and balanced, every perspective is equally valid journalism of the early 2000s often used to have headlines like, does MMR cause autism? I've seen those headlines, and have been exacerbated by those, or no, you know what I mean. Have been gotten angry on those headlines. Early 2000. That now the practice has become more nuanced. So first of all, label the myth as a myth. Second, convey why it is that it's untrue. So that's the second thing. The third thing is provide why someone is saying it is true. So alternative explanation. And so it's not like empty space. If you dislodge a myth and you don't provide an alternative explanation why people are saying what they're saying, then it comes back. So there are certain approaches that can be applied. The bottom line is that there has been a lot of evidence generation, evidence synthesis. This is not amateur hour to do it properly and using those tools.
Thank you. That's really interesting. We have another question from the Q&A box. I'll give this to you, Dr. Omar. Do you have any predictions on what companies can do that is separate from the government to help? That is, can companies require employees to have a vaccine or their customers? And would these kinds of mandatory requirements from the commercial sector help with deployment, or would they hurt?
So it depends on the business, but not right now. So right now, for the first several months, mandates should not be on the table. We actually had I paired up with a couple of lawyers and law professors to actually write something around this in July. Because again, we could see this coming to set a 6 criteria for before any entity, governments or companies, could and should consider mandates. And that included an authorized vaccine, reasonable safety record, clear communication, inadequate voluntary response, and a raging outbreak, etc. So those haven't been met, both by the government or the companies right now. But then going forward, it could be that after the supply is secured, and that was the another criterion, after the supply is stable, etc., certain kinds of businesses. So not every business is the same. So an airline where the most unnatural thing we do as humans is to fly in a steel tube, and so as if it's routine. And so in those kinds of things, airlines have a different responsibility. Meatpacking plants have a different responsibility. Healthcare systems have a different responsibility. And so on the other hand, other businesses that do not have that kind of an engagement for their core business have a different kind of framework. Like a tech company for their own employee have a different kind of a calculus there. So it will depend on the companies, even if those criteria are met. The third thing is that well beyond mandates, the corporate sector can play a very useful role by doing 2 things: not cutting in line, not waving their checkbooks in front of companies, etc., to bypass the other sort of set criteria, because this will be highly disruptive and will have substantial dominoes effects in countries beyond the US as well. So those of us who, again, didn't wake up to the beauty of infectious diseases and vaccines on March 15th when everyone was sent home, have seen these kinds of disruptive things happen before this pandemic as well. But on the positive side, what companies can do, this is what they shouldn't do, what they can do is when their employees are eligible, so with comorbidities, some people stay at companies and their stay lasts so long that you can consider companies long-term care facilities, but that's not what we mean when we say long-term care facilities. We should, if otherwise, by comorbidity, by age for some reason, and other risk factors as the recommendations expand, if just like flu vaccine is often distributed through companies, that's a huge way of supporting the system. Get that burden off of the local health department and say, look, we're going to take your supply. We're going to have the same thing because it's free for everyone. We're not going to cut it in line, but it is our nurses, our physicians, our clinics distributing it so that we shoulder the burden, etc. And there are very large employers in this country and throughout the world that can be extremely helpful. And then beyond that, sort of with logistics, with technology, and so on and so forth.
Right. Dr. Asma, just jumping off of that, I wanted to talk to you also about the role of the commercial sector, because in these hard to reach places throughout the world, there are large corporations that still have a footprint. Andrew and I had been talking about how Coca-Cola has been involved for years in distributing medicine in parts of Africa. So do you see a role for the commercial sector in helping with this distribution? Maybe not the ultra cold that Pfizer requires, but as Moderna and others come on the market, would that be a logical option?
Again, I think the COVAX facility and the various components within the COVAX accelerators has different streams, including the collaboration and coordination with the private sector. Public-private partnership is going to be extremely important within in response to COVID vaccination distribution, supply, and demand. WHO has been in good partnership relations with a number of private sectors, and we have been quite grateful with the pro bono support that many of the private sectors have offered WHO. And we were this afternoon with Esti from ESRI, who shared some of the experiences using the geospatial information and the capacities that can be deployed to countries to strengthen countries' national systems. WHO's main purpose is to ensure that the countries have the capacity and the essential health systems are built and sustained. And we have a very short window of opportunity so that we put in systems so that countries are prepared for another pandemic, but also now with response and recovery, we put in systems that are sustainable. So I think the collaborative relationships that have come across built across through the COVAX, I think has been incredibly useful. And yes, there is a role for every stakeholder. We need the whole government approach. We need a very coordinated approach to address, as Dr. Tedros says, solidarity is, I think, the word and the spirit that we ought to be keeping in mind. And as Saad said, I think we ought to also be cautious in not rushing and causing disruptions, and keeping an eye in terms of the systematic support that is needed to respond to country needs. And each of the countries are going to be unique, and within countries the requirements are going to be distinct and unique.
Got it. Yeah, you don't want a bunch of for-profit companies rushing in and mucking up everything, but I think it would be interesting to see how they can get involved. We have another question in the question box. I'm going to direct this to you, Andrew. How will we know in the short term if the vaccination distribution process has been a success? What is the timeline? What are the specific numbers you're looking at? How are we measuring this?
Well, I mean, not to be redundant with the earlier point, but it's going to really depend on where you're talking about. You know, in the United States, I believe the target is for, you know, something like 90% completion by the summer. I don't know whether that's going to be realistic or not, and you know, it's going to depend as well on you know, kind of the level at which people choose to get vaccinated and some of the variances around what may already be pockets of herd immunity. I mean, the United States is an interesting example in this case. I mean, the level at which the virus has spread means that a reasonable number of people, and far more by the time we're talking about the summertime, will have been infected with COVID and will have some form of immunity. And how long that lasts, we don't know, but that changes the numbers in terms of how many people actually need to get vaccinated. I think this question around making sure that monitoring systems are in place to be able to give you a number on how many people have been vaccinated, where that is, full transparency on the systems is going to be one of the best antidotes towards responding to the points that Dr. Omar made earlier around misinformation and rumor around, people that, people don't literally need to jump the queue in order for the idea that this is happening to spread fairly rapidly around the world. I was talking with folks in the Philippines not too long ago who were talking about how this year is a local elections year in the Philippines. They elect a very large number of local officials. It's a very politicized kind of environment, and there's a lot of concern that rumor about one group being vaccinated, another group not, and the lack of verifiability on that may in and of itself produce, information velocity that could be disruptive. So the key is going to then, like we mentioned data logging before. Data logging is important to ensure that, we have information about, say, the equipment that's being used and where the vaccines are going, but being able to have, consistent metrics on, literally that they have been administered, rates of wastage. I would recommend maximum transparency on this kind of thing because of the information that's been said before about the disruptions through misinformation in these systems.
Right. Okay, we're about up against the clock, but before we go, I wanted to ask each of you, because I think we all probably know somebody in our lives who does have a fear, hesitancy around the vaccine. So when you guys encounter those people in your lives, what do you tell them? And Dr. Garrity, I'll start with you.
I guess I start by telling them that I have zero concerns. I'll be first in line, except that actually the phasing I'm last in line, but still I'm ready, willing, and able to take it myself. And I guess when I'm talking to my family, I try to provide them with some of the information about what the process is like, that this is a science-based effort. It's not a political effort, and really try to help them understand that all safety precautions have been dealt with, and we will continue to do so. So I really try to reach to where I think people are having concerns.
Dr. Asma?
I think driven by science, and thus far what we have seen is the efficacy and the safety of the vaccines. I think the numbers speak where we have seen that there is the safety and efficacy over 95, 94%. I think it is a sound number that this is safe. And vaccines in the past have shown to prevent a number of diseases, and this is preventable. And we should go ahead. Yes.
Andrew?
Yeah, I would echo these same comments that, we have, it's important for people to know a lot of detail about how vaccine trials happen, why we believe that the numbers like 95% effectivity are real numbers. They're based on a real process that is traceable and verifiable and has roots in strong science. And that, there are side effects that people may have if you might feel if a little bit you might get a fever and feel not that great immediately after, but that's not a sign that the vaccine's not working. That's a sign that it is working. And so, making clear to people what to expect when this is administered is a really important factor for assuring that you're not going to feel that something went wrong and that the experts have let you down.
And Dr. Omer, what do you tell people who are concerned about taking the vaccine?
So I start with the sort of the evidence base that suggests that false reassurances can backfire in the long run. They do increase short-term confidence. And so here's the approach that I take. One is to acknowledge that, yes, this is a new vaccine. Having said that, it has already been tested in tens of thousands of people. The other thing I emphasize is the process. And that indeed is a misconception that a fast process, it doesn't necessarily mean it's where corners have been cut. So taking people through the process, and it is indeed the case that that all the major steps, all the necessary steps have been taken so far to get it this far. But I also emphasize that we do have systems to monitor safety on an ongoing basis that are more robust than before. And there are sincere people and oversight that is there that is not connected to commercial interest, that has approved, that has reviewed. And the last thing I say is to emphasize the feature we identified, elite endorsement, in the sense people like Fauci, healthcare providers that score really high. And so use those kinds of approaches to say that, look, this risk versus benefit assessment so heavily weighs in benefit without ignoring and without ridiculing people's perceptions of risk. It so heavily weighs, it has been looked at systematically in favor of benefit, that those who know the most are taking it themselves and recommending it to their loved ones. It's a nuanced answer, but whenever in this pandemic we have tried to go for shortcuts, we have paid for it.
Right. Well, I will take those pieces of advice with me. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you to all of our panelists. And this is a topic we're going to continue to cover on protocol.com. So check us out there. And thank you so much. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.